Welcome, old friends, new friends, hopefully friends in any case. It's great to have you in the third of this semester presentation by the Initiative for the Science of the Human Past at Harvard University on a very exciting study that comes out of our group that was published in the journal Cell in December. It's about migrations, Mediterranean to Slavic, on the frontier of the Roman Empire on the Danube River. The Initiative for the Science of the Human Past has been around for about 15 years, and its goal is to use, to deploy, to exploit, to understand, and to invent with the advances of the sciences, life, data, Earth, in synthesis with the humanities, archaeology and history, to discover new things about the human past, completely new evidence, new data that has never been seen before, that's produced by the scientific revolution and archaeology that we're living through in our own time. And that's what we're going to do today. Very exciting stuff. The Science of the Human Past starts with freshmen at Harvard College and runs all the way up to the most senior professors through every form of distinction and achievement in this amazing institution of Harvard University. And you're going to be meeting some of our wonderful leading lights here. These are the things that we bring together in the service of the humanities and in the discovery of our human past. And it's not just the remote human past, our first immigrations out of Africa, but all the way to 19th century US history, as those of you who were present for the event on the Catoctin Mountain iron furnace in February, in which David Reich's lab and Aideen Harney were able to recover the ancient DNA of the enslaved Africans who made iron muniments for the American Revolution and freedom, but not theirs. The Science of the Human Past has the privilege of being guided by a steering committee drawn from across the schools and divisions of the university, and you get an idea from our group here. And the Science of the Human Past serves as the Harvard Foundation for an innovative virtual research program, a kind of research institute that is headquartered at Harvard in the Science of the Human Past, and in Germany, to the Max Planck Society at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, and uses the tremendous complementarity of ancient DNA, archaeological, historical, isotopic, earth sciences, and other developments in sciences and humanities between Harvard and the Max Planck Institute to go to new places. The Max Planck Harvard Research Center for the Archaeoscience of the Ancient Mediterranean has a college, very Roman, a collegium of 5 directors, 2 of whom are at Harvard, 2 of whom are at the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, and 1 of whom is at both, my friend and admired colleague, Professor Christina Warner. Today, our theme is migrations, as documented by the genetic ancestry from the remains of people from Roman times on the Roman frontier and this side of the Roman frontier in the first millennium of our era. This is the results of the studies that were presented, as I mentioned, in the journal Cell in December. And without any further ado, I want to invite our first speaker, Professor David Reich, in whose lab this work was done. He'll be followed by the lead author, my good friend, Dr. Inigo Oralde from the University of the Basque Country in Spain, who will be followed by Kyle Harper, holds his PhD from Harvard University, professor of classics and letters at the University of Oklahoma, and such a dedicated scholar that he's off being a visiting professor at the Collège de France in Paris, and he's joining us from there instead of going out and eating oysters. What a mensch. We're going to have comments from my wonderful colleague, Professor Margaret Andrews here in the Department of Classics, and then Dr. Victoria Mosley and Dr. Solène Toadek, our postdocs, respectively, in the Getty Foundation Fellowship and the Lounsbury Foundation Fellowship, will have a few comments. And we also have the privilege of having here in veritable presence Dr. Alison Barton, who is paired with Dr. Moses in teaching in an enterprise sponsored by the Getty, in which Dr. Barton is teaching genetics to Dr. Moses, and Dr. Moses is teaching archaeology to Allison. So there we are. The floor is open, and David, it's yours.
Hi. So I'm very happy to be here today. I'm only going to speak for a few minutes because really this presentation is a joint presentation by Inigo and myself, and I'm really going to just introduce it, and Inigo's going to get into the data. So the topic of our presentation is this paper, to talk about the scientific part of the paper. Migrations Mediterranean to Slavic Ancient DNA reveals the Roman Empire's cosmopolitan Danube frontier from Domitian to the Slavs. And this is an image of the site of MHAAM, which is the site in present-day Serbia, which is, you'll hear about more, and is the source of the plurality of the individuals that we analyze in this study. So just a review of ancient DNA data. So it starts with a human remain, like this ear bone, and then in a clean room where the goal is to get beneath the surface of the remain. We try to take a little bit of sample that is particularly rich in DNA. This is the cochlea of the inner ear, which is one of the best sources of DNA. We then release we take out some powder and we release the DNA in a solution that's optimized to release the DNA, and then we sequence it, often by enriching for places in the genome that are informative about human history. That's the broad approach, and it's made it possible to really generate large amounts of data regularly from ancient remains. The first whole genome data was produced in 2010, and there were only a few samples per year until 2014. And then it really took off through this enrichment technology where we target positions of the genome that are of high interest. And then it was roboticized beginning in 2018. And there was a real takeoff. And I'm aware of data from well more than 20,000 individuals for which there's genome-wide data. And that's just what we're aware of in our laboratory. There's other groups that are doing much more as well. So one of the things that's happened in this period is that the proportion of the DNA that was originally studied was very old. So these were initially archaic humans like Neanderthals and Denisovans, super interesting. And prehistoric people before the invention of writing, where the people were trying to study the transitions between the hunter-gatherer period and the farming period in Western Eurasia and other parts of the world. But the percentage of samples from more recent periods, this is showed before, after, in the last 2,000 years, is going up and up and up and up. And so what's really happened is it's become possible to do large sample size studies from the last couple of thousand years. And when we started ancient DNA, we really, Nick Patterson, for example, who's here, and I were thinking, really, how is it going to be possible to compete with the historical record, which is so rich, and add anything new to it, add anything complementary to it with ancient DNA data? And so this study that you'll hear about today is an example where we try to add something. And Inigo will go on. I just wanted to say two things. The studies unfolded over a couple of years, and the initial version of this study really was overwhelmingly done by geneticists and archaeologists and didn't really involve historians very centrally. And the work that we produced, the preprint, the first preprint of this work, was much less rich than the final product. And it was because we really hadn't contextualized it fully within the historical record, which is what really needed to happen, because this work is in dialogue with the historical record, the period of the period of writing. And in the revision of the work and the new submission of the work, we really engaged with the two of the people who will be speaking today, Kyle Harper and Mike McCormick, who ended up editing a really rich and systematic archaeological accompanying paper to this one, and also contributed very centrally to turning the paper itself into a real engagement between history and genetics. And that's really what this presentation is about. I think one of the things that's evolving is the scholarly form for this type of collaboration between history and genetics, and it's so new that history is really being touched by ancient DNA that there's not yet a form. So right now, these papers are being written as accompanying papers that are called supplements in genetics papers. But it's possible that other forms could evolve. For example, a parallel form that would really be its own paper that would discuss the same results from a historical perspective. And so really we're in a time when we're experimenting with scholarly systems, not just with information generation. Inigo?
Yeah, hi. Is it working? Okay, yeah, so our study frames within this same process that David just mentioned, this increase in the number of genomes from the historical period, and we were able to retrieve the genome from 145 individuals from the Balkans dated to the first millennium CE. And here on the panel on the left, you can see the chronological distribution of the samples separated by the different sites. We have 35 sites. And here on the right, you can see the geographical distribution. And I have to say that the vast majority of individuals, I think 130, actually come from the present-day countries of Serbia and Croatia. And they are mostly located along the Danube, as you see here, but also across the Adriatic coast. And before this study, we basically have no data from the Balkans during this time period. So this is a really unique data set. And just allow me to highlight the site that was more densely sampled in our study, which is Viminacium, who was the capital of Upper Moesia province in the Roman Empire. And we sampled individuals from 6 different necropolises, 4 dated to the Roman period and 2 dated to the medieval period. And this is important because you know, if you sample 4 different necropolis, that allows you to have a more complete representation of the society that was living at that time, as compared to just having maybe just one necropolis that could be biased towards a specific stratum of the society. So now moving to the results, I wanted to first talk briefly about the genetic structure of the Balkans before and after our period of interest, which is the first millennium CE. And I'm going to be using this principal component analysis that was run on 600,000 genetic markers. And in this PCA, the individuals are close together if they have high genetic affinity, and if they not, they are far away in the PCA. And each symbol here represents one present-day individual from the Near East or from Europe. And for the ancient groups, I didn't use the symbols. I used these polygons that delineate the position of all the individuals from that particular population. So, for instance, all individuals from Bulgaria Iron Age, they all fall within this polygon here. And what I want to focus on is the fact that there is the Balkan Iron Age population. So before our period of interest, they form a genetic line on PC1 that goes from the more northern populations, such as Serbia Bronze Age, Croatia Iron Age on the left, towards more southern populations, such as Bulgaria Iron Age and the Aegean Bronze Age on the right. And it's very interesting because if we now focus on present-day populations, they also form a very similar line on PC1 with the same geographical pattern. Here on the left, we find like present-day Croatians, for instance, or more on the north. And then going to the right, we move to the south. So this would be the present-day Greeks. So these are like 2 parallel lines that run on PC1, but they are shifted from one another. And that means that present-day population from the Balkans are not the direct descendants of the population that were living in the same area during the Iron Age. There must have been some demographic processes that shift this line upwards in PC2. And if we now put here our individuals, the ancient individuals that we sequenced from the first millennium CE, we see that some of them overlap the Balkan Iron Age line, some of them overlap the present-day line, but there are others that don't overlap any of these lines. They flow far beyond each of these lines. We have many individuals that are very close to the Near Eastern part of the PCA, other individuals here that are very close to the Central and Northern European part of the PCA. We have even individuals that are far beyond the present-day Near Eastern and European diversity. And now what I'm going to do is just go over 5 interesting insights that the study of the samples allow us to get. So I'm going to use in this bar plot. That's very easy. Each bar represents one individual, and individuals are ordered by approximate chronology from left to right, and the different colors represent the different ancestries. So going into the first interesting topic is we have this blue ancestry, which is ancestry derived from the previous population, from the Balkan Iron Age populations. And what we see is that this ancestry is widespread in our transect. In the first half of the first millennium, we see many individuals that are fully derived from Balkan Iron Age populations. Others have this ancestry in admixture form. And this means that the local population didn't vanish with the Roman control of the area. They remain in the area, and we see their descendants fully integrated into Roman society. The second interesting topic is that we find a large-scale demographic input from Western Anatolia. Is this yellow ancestry that you can see. Around a third of the individuals that we have in this early period have predominantly a West Anatolian ancestry. And as you can see, after around 300 CE, we stop seeing individuals that are fully Anatolian, which means that probably these pools of admixture happen, up to the 3rd century CE, and later we see this ancestry in admixture form, but we never see again individuals that are fully Anatolians. And our dataset also allows us to look at the social dynamics of this process. We have, for instance, many individuals that are fully or predominantly Anatolian that were buried in high status tombs, like this one, for instance, which is a stone sarcophagus at Biminacium, with very, very rich grave goods. And when the archaeologists opened this sarcophagus, they found 2 individuals, 1 man and 1 woman. And when we analyzed the genome of the man, it turned out to be fully local, so fully descendant from Iron Age populations, but the woman was fully Anatolian. So here, this is one case, and we have other cases showing that these 2 groups, so people descended from the local populations and Anatolian descendant people, were interacting, were reproducing, so they were not isolated from each other, and they were buried at the same sites, same necropolises, and even within the same burials. We also have some individuals of African origin. Within this, a migration or a demographic input from a different nature as compared to the Anatolian input, because we only see it in 3 individuals around the 2nd century CE, but we don't see any other individuals. So it's probably more sporadic mobility rather than a large demographic input. And 2 of them have North African ancestry, but the other individual has East African ancestry. But I'm not going to go into detail because I think Mike is going to cover more this individual. And then, starting around the 3rd century CE, we detect the arrival of Central and Northern European ancestry that we associate with the arrival of predominantly Germanic tribes that we know from historical records. And but we also see the arrival of a steppe ancestry, steppe-related ancestry, here in dark green. And an interesting point is that these 2 ancestries tend to co-localize in the same individuals, which means that there was probably a previous step of admixture between these 2 ancestries, maybe somewhere around present-day Ukraine, where these 2 ancestries came together, and then they move into the frontiers of the Roman Empire. But these 2 ancestries, we see it, in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th century CE, but we don't see them that much on the later period. So we think that this was not a very demographically important event. Unlike this next topic that we are going to be talking about, which is the arrival of Eastern European ancestry here in red. So we find one woman very early here that is fully Eastern European, and then we have to wait until around the 6th, 7th century that we see this red ancestry appearing all over the place in basically the vast majority of sites where we look at. And we associate this ancestry with the arrival of the Slavic groups to the area. And we again can have some insights into the social dynamics of this event. We have here the site of Nustar, which is this cemetery is dated around the 8th century CE. And we have here this individual who is the son of this woman. And when we analyze the woman, it turned out to be around 90% Eastern European. And then her son is around 60% Eastern European. And we don't have the father, but we can guess what his ancestry would look like. And it would be around 30% Eastern European, which is precisely more or less the same as the other individuals that we have from the site. We don't have the father, but the other individuals that we have from the site are pretty much what we would expect for the father. So we can imagine that maybe this woman was incorporated into this community and he reproduced with one of the men from this community, even though we don't have that genome. So this is just some interesting information about the interaction between these two groups, these incoming Eastern European populations and the local populations of the time. And finally, just to mention that when we look at present-day populations, we find this ancestry, this Eastern European ancestry, all over the region. So this means that this event was demographically important and it had long-term consequences. Of course, with different intensity, more in the north than in the south. And yeah, that was basically all I wanted to say for today. And I'm happy to talk more in the discussion. And before I finish, let me acknowledge Pablo Carrion, which is my PhD student and who did many analyses that I just saw. So yeah, thank you.
Now we'll hear from Kyle Harper.
Great. Can you hear me and see the slides? Okay, they should be. Good. Well, greetings, everyone. Thank you for indulging me from a distance presentation. It's been really a pleasure to be a part of this amazing collaboration. And I'll speak briefly about my perspective on the findings, the results from the perspective of a historian, principally a Roman and late antique historian, and try to put a little bit into the regional and historical context, the genetic findings. You see here the map of the sequenced individuals, which the newly sequenced individuals come from this arc reaching from Mediana, going along the Danube River and then back along the Adriatic coast. And this is a region that is incorporated into the Roman Empire in the reign of Augustus. Really, the Romans had interests and military operations in the regions prior to Augustus, but it's really in the reign of the first Roman Emperor Augustus in the last decades before the Common Era. And in the first decade of the Common Era, that this Danube region is really brought into the Roman Empire. It's a crucially important region strategically, with the Danube frontier forming one of the most important and one of the most heavily militarized frontiers in the Roman world. I think at the peak, there's something like 12 of the 30 Roman legions are permanently stationed along the Danube. So this is a really heavily defended and guarded frontier. That means lots of legions, means lots of legionaries, lots of Roman soldiers, and all of the economic and fiscal activity that the Roman army brings. So this is really an important 4 year of Roman imperialism. And when we think about the population history of this region, we're interested in what are the dynamics of Roman power, Roman imperialism, and how do they affect the population history of a region that really is incorporated into the Roman world. It's in the first century that the process of Romanization really begins with the construction of Roman-style roads, legionary camps, and economic exploitation of the wealthy mineral resources and the opportunities for exchange both across the Danube with the non-Roman world and then up and down the Danube, running from the Black Forest to the Black Sea. So this is a crucial region for trade, for military power. It's incorporated into the Roman Empire under Augustus, and it's slowly but really surely Romanized, and really to the extent that, in fact, the local indigenous Illyrian languages are largely replaced. So it's a significant enough cultural process that it registers in linguistic change. A second phase in the very long term history of this period begins in the 3rd century with a period of crisis. The reign of the Emperor Decius, who I'll mention again, 249, really is the beginning of a new phase in the history of the Roman Empire and also of the history of this region, one that's marked by the incorporation of people from across the Danube into the Roman Empire, into the Roman military. In the 4th century, this is really a strongly Roman region, but again, in the late 4th and particularly the 5th century, the Roman Empire struggles at times to maintain its dominance in this region. From the 420s, the Huns are a major presence, and Roman power really flickers in the region through the end of the 5th century. But right through the reigns of the Roman emperors Anastasius and Justinian in the early 6th century, this is really a strongly Romanized region. But then a new phase, we can say, begins sometime in the middle, the 3rd quarter of the 6th century, 550, 575. Roman control of this region is really lost, and so this is sort of permanently de-Romanized in a political sense from the middle of the 6th century. So those are historical events that we know without knowing anything about the population history of this region. So how does the findings of the study look from that perspective? Here you see very quickly a kind of administrative map. Most of our newly reported genomes come from Upper Moesia, and particularly Viminacium, as well as the Dalmatian coast. So here's the representation, similar to what Inigo showed, that is actually drawn from the article itself. You're looking at 6 different ancestry types, and the time axis runs from top to bottom, so you can see the dates running from 0 to 1000 on the left axis. And the red lines demarcate those periods that I noted earlier. So the crisis of the 3rd century is the top red line. This is early Roman history at the top. This is sort of later Roman history between the 2 red lines, and then post-Roman history after the red lines. And so a study like this lets us ask questions in a new way. What does Romanization look like from a population history perspective? I think, to me, one of the more surprising findings is the lack of ancestry from the Western Mediterranean. So where are the Italians? This is a heavily militarized region where the Latin language becomes dominant. And yet this seems to happen with what we find in this sample, no permanent traces of Western Mediterranean ancestry. So it's sort of an imperialist dynamic that doesn't register in a large influx of population from the Western Mediterranean. Instead, you can see what does happen is a continuity of the Iron Age and Balkan local population, as well as an influx from the Western Anatolia and Levantine regions. Here in the second box, you see this really strong presence that we're starting to see in other ancient DNA studies from Italy. And I think is not totally well understood at this point. Raises a number of questions about who are these West Anatolian Levantine populations. Why does the Roman Empire seem to facilitate their mobility throughout the Roman world? As Inigo mentioned, and as Mike will talk about, there's sporadic presence of both individuals from North Africa, as well as remarkably one individual from East Africa. Then you see in the right panel, I'm going to flip ahead in time. In the post-250 period, you see the appearance of people from Central and Northern Europe, presumably related to different so-called Germanic groups, as well as people of steppe ancestry that come really in this period of the later Roman Empire. So you can also remember, I'll bring this up again, this is also a very important moment in the history of the Roman Empire when people from this very precise region start to rule the Roman Empire. So this tells us something about the population history of a region that ultimately came to produce the majority of the late Roman imperial dynasties. And then finally, the demise of Roman political control in the region really is reflected in really profound changes in the population history of the region. The continuity of the local population, the Anatolian influx, but the disappearance of the central Northern European related. And again, as a historian, this to me was one of the more surprising findings. That is that the Germanic and steppe like ancestry groups don't leave a persistent, visible trace in the ancestry in the samples that we have. Whereas in this case, the appearance of a major population turnover that is, of course, also registered in linguistic change, again, this time with the spread of Slavic languages and reflected in the rise of East European ancestry. So this is a question that we want to explore further and ask in light of genetic as well as archaeological and historical data. Why do some populations not persist? So very briefly, I mentioned that one of the really interesting things about this region is that the majority of later Roman emperors, from either you can count it from the accession of Decius in 249, or maybe better, the rise of Claudius Gothicus, Claudius II in 268. This little region that we've sampled very heavily now is really the origin, the source region of the majority of late imperial dynasties. So it's a fascinating insight to say, what was it about this region? What can we learn about the people who lived here, and how did they ultimately come to rule the later Roman Empire for a period of over 3.5 centuries. This is, I think, for me, been so stimulating because it's a model of how archaeologists, geneticists, and historians can work together. I think to reflect on something that David said, as archaeogenetics moves into the historical period, it's still we're still exploring a slice of the past that has exerted a major and lasting influence on the population history of the region to this day. The Roman Empire really has effects on populations that have left their mark on long-term ancestry over an important world region. And we know this thanks now to the integration of knowledge from archaeology, the supplement that Mike and I edited, that is reflective of the tremendous tradition of regional archaeology, particularly in Serbia and Croatia, that forms the sort of third leg of the tripod, and the way that we can understand this data that lets us take a look at individual histories as well as the biggest trends. And increasingly, as we look at the historical period, lets us design archaeogenetic sampling around studies that are trying to target things that as historians we want to know, but aren't able to ask of the kinds of documents that we have. Thank you, and I now pass the baton over to Mike.
Thank you, Kyle. So, this is a brief summary, a visual summary of the paper that was published in December. I'm going to talk about five of the five arrows, five of the arrows that you see there. They represent migration movements by groups and by individuals. And I'm going to move from the story of groups to the story of individuals, groups. It's this is totally unexpected data in so many ways. I want to start by saying thank you to the archaeologists of the region. Their work is what produced the evidence that we've been able to analyze. They have helped us from start to finish. They have supplied not just the individuals, but the archaeological expertise that they acquired in the excavation, in working in the soil with these individuals, with these archaeological features. They have helped us find published scientific literature from the Balkans, in Serbian, Croatian, in Slovenian, which even the mighty Widener Library has not collected. So from start to finish, we are indebted to our friends and colleagues, the archaeologists of the various countries who collaborated in this extremely unusual undertaking. I want to mention in particular 2 colleagues from the region, Miodrag Grbić and Ilya Mikic, who have never ceased to answer my unending questions. Where did this come from? How do we know this? Where's the PDF? With grace and generosity. So thank you very much. Here you can see the presentation of the archaeological overview. It was a labor of, I guess, love by Kyle and me for many months to take this very disparate information in many, many different languages and to put it into a synthesized, organized, analytical form, and then to supplement it with answers to our questions from the archaeologists who did the excavation. And so you'll find in the archaeological supplement what we consider a truly a new scholarly contribution, which builds on the work of our regional colleagues, which adds a fair bit of unpublished information and raises new questions. Every entry for every site has the name of the site in alphabetical order. That required doing, and basic information about the geography, the settlement history, the history of excavation, a summary of the individuals and what we found, and then individual by individual, a brief synopsis of the archaeological context, the materials, the grave goods that may have accompanied this person to the tomb, dating criteria, and the archaeogenetic result. And so this is a typical one for Mediana, a suburb of the important city of Niš in Serbia, which is where the Emperor Constantine was born, one of those many emperors from the region. So I'm going to talk about 2 individuals and 3 groups, 2 individuals at greater length and 2 groups at greater length. The first is just look at this. This is our Mapping Past Societies, the greatest contribution to digital humanities by Harvard undergraduates I'm aware of, a free digital atlas of historical and archaeological information. These are the Roman fortifications and military sites, and you can see the extraordinary concentration in this area, confirming what Professor Harper had to say about the centrality of this region, not just spatially, but strategically and culturally and economically for the Roman Empire. There are mines in the region. Viminacium is the metropolitan capital of the province in question, and a very important place in the overall administrative structure of the Roman Empire, visited a number of times by Roman emperors. The first big shock in our knowledge of the ancient world came in a study published in 2019 by a group under Dr. Antonio at Stanford University, which revealed a massive migration of people from Anatolia, that's to say from Asia Minor, Eastern Turkey, and from the Levant into the megalopolis of Rome and its suburbs between about 200 BC and 200 CE. This is one of the group stories. So this was pretty impressive. Even more surprising, in a study published in 2021 and led by Professor Cosimo Post, now of the University of Tübingen, which I had the privilege of co-authoring, the same group story reappeared in individuals excavated in central Italy. We see a massive migration, large-scale migration of people from the Eastern Mediterranean and from Anatolia, from Asia Minor, into central Italy. Some of them will have been slaves, but not all of them. We can see the wealth of the Roman Empire being sucked into Rome and following the wealth. People from the Eastern Mediterranean and indeed from all over the Roman world, as we'll see. It is a massive, internal economically driven migration inside the empire whose genetic impact is still visible in the DNA of the populations of Italy today. And in our study, we saw that the gigantic surge in wealth extended also up to and migration magnetism also to the Danube frontier, particularly in Viminacium, but in the general area. Again, as you saw from Inigo's presentation, the genetic impact of these migrants from the Eastern Mediterranean, from Anatolia, was so great, it is still present in the genomes of the people born there today. An individual story takes us to Viminacium. this provincial capital, and to one of the several necropolises that have been excavated in the region. It's the site of an industrial exploitation, a thermal plant and quarry. So they're destroying everything to do this. And so the rescue excavations have been going at a frenetic pace for decades. And that is one of the reasons we know so much about this particular place. I want to tell you about individual 15499, who is a male. He was 15 to 18 years old when he died. He was buried apparently in a wood coffin. He had meager but respectable grave goods, furnishings, a pot, a glass, a coin in his mouth, typical Roman, an obol for Charon, the ferryman, to take him across the Styx to the Elysian fields, to pay for the ferry ride. A Roman in every fashion. Imagine our shock when he also had an unusual lamp with an eagle on it, buried with him. You can see the mark of the soot on the lamp. It was used before it accompanied him into the afterlife. You can imagine our shock when we got his ancient DNA. It's entirely East African. I'm always skeptical. We got the dental enamel isotopic report, which reveals his childhood diet. He ate an overwhelmingly seafood diet in his childhood. This takes us to the coast of East Africa, to the Indian Ocean, and the approaches to the Red Sea. This will be the natal origins of this young man. How did he get from Somalia to the Danube frontier of the Roman Empire? This is a wonderful question. In the 2nd century or so, the obvious way is via Petra. You've all seen it, Raiders of the Lost Ark or whatever it's called. The Nabatean caravan network that connected through camel trade the wealth of India and beyond with the Roman Empire through the Red Sea, up the Arabian Peninsula, across the Red Sea, and into the empire. He could well have traveled in the Nabatean caravan network from East Africa to the Danube. Notice the eagle. There were various hypotheses expressed about why he had an eagle. They're not common in people's graves, but I would note that the eagle is the symbol of the Nabatean god Dushara, and that god is a very important divinity in the Nabatean pantheon. And indeed, if you've had the privilege of going to Petra or seeing other Nabatean sites, you will have seen eagles on the tombs, because this is the god that defends tombs against desecrators in the Nabatean tradition. This could be the story of this young man. Other group migrations include those you've heard about, the North Central Europe related ancestries. We have 3 individuals who come directly from North and Central Europe, which aligns generally with Germanic speakers. And then we have the second group of 13 people who have the same Germanic signal, but admixed with the steppe, the Kazakh and the Pontic steppe. That is to say, people probably of the Gothic Federation, which grew up through the assimilation of steppe peoples and Germanic migrants to the area north of the Black Sea, today a site, as you know, of terrible warfare. And finally, the last group migration that we've heard the most about, the East European related. Most of the people today who show this genome speak Slavic languages. It is a fair inference that most of the people who had this genome in the past come from this same cultural group at this point in our knowledge. We had 23 individuals for the period between 600 and 1000. There were people that were later than that I'm not going to talk about here. They confirm the basic picture. We have 23 individuals from most of the sites that you see in the map, dating between 600 and 1000 CE. They're almost all admixed. That is to say, these people have come from elsewhere and joined with local people and produced children out of their admixture, out of their assimilation. And you can see they've admixed with Balkans plus Anatolia plus Eastern Europe, Balkans or Anatolia in Eastern Europe, and one Eastern Europe related person who we already saw, who's not admixed from the 7th, 8th, or 9th century. Chronology's not great. I want to close with an individual story, individual 32305. This person also was buried out of the Roman provincial capital of Viminacium in the necropolis known as Viši grobalja, which means more graves in Serbo-Croatian. There's a lot of them, as you will have heard. This is a typical, modest, economic status Roman woman, to judge from what we can see archaeologically. She's a female. She died older than 45. That's good for a woman because the mortality rates are huge in antiquity in the Middle Ages in the childbearing years. She had glass beads, perhaps she was wearing a necklace, 3 bronze rings, and a bronze coin, which is dated to the 3rd century and could have gotten into the excavation, into the soil surreptitiously, because she is radiocarbon dated between 25 and 203, 95%, 94.6% confidence. So it's 5% confidence she could have come from another period, but she's likely 2nd century, since Viminacium really starts up in the late 1st century of our era. And her ancestry is Eastern European related, what we would call today Slav. This was absolutely stupefying to find a person of this date, and it was the same tooth that produced the genetic evidence that was radiocarbon dated. I made very careful to check about that. Buried as a Roman woman in this provincial capital. Not only that, always being skeptical, I want to know what she ate. And the isotopes of her teeth tell us that she was a vegetarian largely, and the cereals that she ate followed the C4 photosynthetic pathway. That is to say, most probably she ate millet, which Romans did not much like, but which the Slavs are known to have eaten in abundance from both the historical and archaeological record. So here again, the isotopes provide dietary insights that confirm quite independently the ancient DNA evidence. So it's hard to doubt that we have here the first attested Slav who happens to be a woman of Roman civilization on the Danube frontier. Here you can see where her story is and how chronologically distant it is from those who would follow. And it gives us a first clue that what would be the migration of groups later in time was preceded by the percolation of individuals much earlier in time. With our East African, we don't know whether he was just one outlier who happened to make it all the way up to the Danube selling something that he had picked up in Petra, or whether he was just the northern tip of a bigger movement of migration out of East Africa into the southern reaches of the Roman Empire that we have yet to sample. That's something that Dr. Moses will be investigating soon. So this is the story of individual 32305, and it's quite a wonderful story. Thank you for listening to us and for coming and honoring us by your presence and hopefully by your questions. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn the floor over to Dr. Moses.
Thank you for these wonderful presentations and for inviting me to comment on this truly pioneering research. I'm Vicki Moses. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here with MHAAM and the Initiative for the Science of the Human Past, and I'm studying ancient DNA from the Near East, dating to the Classical Antique period. Prior to joining this team, my work has integrated scientific approaches into classical archaeology, mostly through the study of animal bones and teeth from Roman and pre-Roman sites. Coming from this background, I found that the research presenting tonight really is a triumph in how well it bridges scientific data sets and history through the artifacts, through scientific data sets, history, artifacts, and big anthropological questions in such a natural way. This research highlights what can be accomplished through interdisciplinary work with rigorous scientific analyses grounded in anthropological questions of our human past. This study is one that never loses sight of the human aspect. It engages non-specialists with interesting and important findings throughout the paper and makes the genetic data accessible, something that is often lacking in technical, data-driven works. This research is the social science of stories big and small, from large-scale migrations driven by the rise and fall of vast empires to individuals who crossed continents to find new homes in the Balkans. The data are not just aDNA, but isotopes, ceramics, and spatial data, giving a range to the evidence presented. The data really challenge our perspectives on the past, again, at different scales. The shocking finding that despite the militarization and Roman cultural presence of the region, there was not a movement of people with DNA similar to Rome itself calls into question our understanding of how the influence of Rome manifested in this area without a large-scale migration of people from peninsular Italy. How was Roman military and political control so successful and Roman material culture so pervasive even at this great distance from the empire's core? The aDNA also challenges our assumptions about material culture and ancestry. For example, one cemetery that was identified as Germanic from the material remains showed most individuals had local Iron Age Balkan ancestry. In another cemetery, individuals with ancestry from different regions, such as those with Anatolian descent, were buried alongside others with no discernible differences in grave goods or other burial treatment. These situations show a tension between ancestry and other lines of evidence. The burial practice suggests cultural affiliation with a group that does not align with the ancestry. So how does this affect our understanding of how these people self-identified or understood their own lineages? There were clear examples of strong local practices based on lineage, with patrilocality evident in some samples. One thing I liked about this study, and a benefit of ancient DNA, is the ability to identify females who migrated to the area and then became part of the community. This subtle shift in perspective, forefronting the lives of women who came rather than men who stayed, is a significant one, showing that the experiences of people, both women and non-local, who are otherwise lost in the narrative. The same could be said for this extraordinary find of the young person of East African descent, whose reason for movement is unknown, but who represents a phenomenon of movement, either voluntary or involuntary, that was certainly occurring, but can be very difficult to see archaeologically. There are a lot of big topics in this research, such as the movement of people and the union practices during this time span, but I want to reflect on how this study relates to the archaeology of identities. This subject has received much scholarly attention in the past few decades as we try to use material evidence to parse out how people saw themselves and how they saw people inside and outside their communities. As we've seen with the research presented this evening, the ancestry and the material cultures can be at odds with each other, challenging any tidy boxes that we've made to construct identities. This theoretical area of research, the scientific facts of DNA, and the fluidity and unique cultural and individual perspectives on identity will be difficult to bring into alignment, but given how far this field has already come in bridging scientific and humanistic perspectives, I think we're up for the challenge. As a final note, I would be remiss if I didn't speak about the importance of the supplementary archaeological overview. They took an extraordinary amount of data from sites that were excavated from different teams, following different protocols and archaeological traditions, and created a cohesive, systematic, and useful document full of critical information. This kind of archaeological information is invaluable for contextualizing the findings, and it really contributes to replicability. Which sites are we even really talking about? Which context do these bones come from? This can be lost in the shuffle with large data sets. Scholars interested in learning more have a solid lead on where to look next, especially with the citations and the contact information. This supplement increases accessibility of knowledge and visibility of work already done in this region. And my hope is that this supplement will serve as a model for ancient DNA studies in the future to bring scholars together from at times disconnected fields. This impressive project showcases the power of ancient DNA as an integrated part of archaeology and history. And thank you so much for sharing this work and inviting me to comment. Thank you.
We now have the privilege of hearing from Dr. Solen Toilet, who's our Lounsbury postdoctoral fellow at MHAAM.
Oh, good. Yeah, sorry. Is that mine? Yeah. Hi, everyone. So my name is Solène, and as Professor McCormick just said, I am an archaeologist with the Science of the Human Past at Harvard and the Lounsbury Foundation. I specialize in studying burial practices, so I look mostly at the dead people, and from them I try to reconstruct ancient population, who they were, how they were living, what they were doing, what they liked, what they didn't like, and all of this. So I'm really interested in the people, and I'm also really interested in the archaeology aspect of this paper. So this paper is really, really great, as you have all understood by now, I hope, because that should have been clear from the start, but you know. It's really great for archaeologists. Why is it really great for archaeologists? Because we have, again, the supplementary material. We have so much information packed in there. We talked about the excavation history, extremely important. I work a lot on different countries, and one obstacle we often have when we work on multiple countries is different archaeological tradition. We don't excavate the same way everywhere, and we don't excavate the same way now as we did 20 years ago. And having a history of the excavation is really something that we need. This is something that starts every excavation report, because it gives us an idea of the site as a whole, but also on the quantity and quality of the data that we can get. And speaking of quantity and quality, we also have some very good pictures of the skeletons as they were discovered. This is also very important because, of course, we were not there when that was discovered. And as archaeologists, we need to see things. Words can only take you so far. Archaeology is really a visual art, and it's an art. Don't get at me on that. It is an art. And we need to see things for how they were placed. You know, as Professor McCormick was saying, we can look at it at this individual and see, oh, yeah, maybe there was something of a coffin or something like that. We can see where the grave goods were deposited in relation to the body. That's a lot of very important information. Additionally, I'm someone who works a lot on acculturation phenomena. I'm also someone who moves a lot across the world. So I'm always wondering, how do people move? Why do they move? Why do they stay? And how can we see that? And what does it do to a person to move around so much? We've heard from Professor Harper, from all our colleagues today, that we don't have that much of people coming from the Italian peninsula, but we have a huge cultural impact of the Roman Empire. Why is that? How does that work? Do we have a chain reaction of acculturation? So, you know, people coming from other parts of the empire that have already assimilated to the Roman culture arrive here and disseminate, in a sense, the Roman culture? Is it more a question of frequent contact? Is it something that we see a lot today? If we look at our modern society, look at the place of American culture across the world. Look at American media everywhere. I come from France. Our language has changed tremendously in the past few years. We have more and more addition of English words, and that's mostly because of US influence. So are we seeing something similar? Of course, not through films, but something similar in the past. And this is something that the Science of the Human Past and papers like this are allowing us to see. We can test this hypothesis. We can question long-established paradigms. We can really put to the question, what is happening? Who are these people? Where do they come from? And on top of, you know, interdisciplinary collaboration, what this paper shows is that we can actually publish together. We don't have to sacrifice one field to publish the results of the other. We can actually work together and publish together, and that should become the norm. And with that, I'll leave the stage to Professor Meg Andrew. Thank you very much.
And we'll have the privilege now.
Oh, sorry. I can't turn this off.
Who is such a noble colleague. sabbatical, and she has dedicated a few precious hours of her sabbatical time to this enterprise. I'm personally grateful, and I hope you all are, because around here, you really need sabbatical if you take your teaching and administering seriously. So with no further ado, let's hear the comments of
Mike,
Professor Margaret Andrews.
I was told there'd be drinks, so.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mike, and to others who invited me to give some general overview comments about how archaeology and archaeogenetics relate. These will follow sort of seamlessly from what Solène and Vicky have said, but will be a little bit more general at the same time. First and foremost, of course, I want to thank and congratulate the many authors of this paper for giving us a valuable set of hard data about mobility and migration in the late imperial and late antique Balkans. We knew that there was considerable mobility within the region during these times, but the Cell article gives us a much finer sense of which populations were moving in from where and when. And with the Slavic data, how well integrated into the Balkan social fabric they became. Speaking as an archaeologist, this is no mean accomplishment, and it's one that has significant implications for the archaeological community at large, since migrations affect enormous social, economic, and cultural change in their destination locales. I'd like to reflect on how the use of ADNA to understand migration, which, when given these results, affects archaeological thought and method. Not only how it adds to our toolbox and fills in gaps, but also how it might complicate things for us too. There has been some tension in the past between archaeologists and archaeogeneticists, as the two disciplines have evolved together. But today I'd rather think about a few general ways in which they can benefit each other in the future. One of the most important contributions of archaeogenetics in my mind, coming from classical archaeology, is how it can help us mitigate the bias of elite sources, which have been a monkey on our backs ever since the origins of the discipline. In the Cell study, just over 50% of the sampled individuals came from simple inhumations, and just over 40% of the burials lacked any grave goods. While we should, of course, be careful about how much we can assume from these factors, i.e. whether these were in fact individuals of lesser wealth and status, archaeogeneticists can target specific cemeteries and burials more likely to fill in the currently patchy picture of the sub-elite, giving archaeologists insight into a population that they themselves are traditionally less able to find or to analyze from a cultural perspective. We can layer ADNA on top of other information provided by burials and cemeteries to create a more nuanced picture of a settlement's social or economic structures and who its residents were biologically, in addition to culturally. We may know from either archaeological or textual sources that a migration occurred, but we can now know where the moving individuals fell on the socioeconomic scale, both at home and abroad, which might reveal all sorts of things about the dynamics and even causes of the migration. This leads me to the subject of admixture, how extensively a migrating population integrated within a native community over generations, and the timeless archaeological maxim that pots don't equal people, which can be taken a couple of different ways. In one sense, archaeology creates culture groups based on similarities in material culture. And although we all know that they don't, it's easy to make the mistake of assuming that those culture groups correspond to biological or ethnic groups. ADNA, however, can of course show how well or not this was the case, and to what extent a genetic group persisted among a destination population, adding important detail to the archaeological understanding of how the material culture of that destination population changed or not as a result of admixture over generations. In another sense of the maxim, archaeologists today are conditioned to think of the presence of non-indigenous material culture as the result of trade, either direct or indirect, to not assume that people were necessarily moving along with the objects. But ADNA can tell us to what extent the latter may have been true. Archaeologists now have to face how migration can be explanatory of the kinds of cultural, social, and economic change we often attribute to other factors. And this requires careful attention by both archaeogeneticists and archaeologists to their respective data sets and how each related to the other. Archaeogenetics unquestionably benefits archaeology, but there are some questions about migration beyond what people moved and when that archaeology sheds critical light on as well. Archaeology informs the social, economic, and cultural conditions of migration. How connected were the migrating and receiving populations were before migration, and what were the dynamics of any pre-existing relationship? For example, did they already have economic or trade connections? How hierarchical or inclusive was the receiving population? Each of these factors is best addressed archaeologically, and the results directly impact the extent of admixture after migration, and at the same time, inform it. For example, what was the social status of the migrants after arrival and several generations on? There are also the very elusive causes of migration that archaeology can shed unique light on. Migration is very difficult to explain because we lack the ability to pinpoint a place of origin, even with the advances of isotopic analysis. In the study here, for example, we have steppe, Central Europe, Eastern Med, East African. Archaeology, in theory, can mitigate such generalities if we can gather enough data at potential areas of origin. Paleobotanical research can shed light on environmental pressures, while archaeological survey and excavation can inform population pressures, new transportation capabilities, competition or invasion, and structural inequalities within the migrating group. It's also hard to know the exact path of migration and how long it took to complete the journey. Just as we can try to build an archaeological corpus in potential origin regions, we can look for foreigners among populations between these and the destinations. But that process will have to begin as an archaeological one to find the burial locations, provide dates, and inform their broader context. Regional surveys in relevant regions could be indispensable here. Dating brings me to another way in which archaeology is vital for archaeogenetic research. Given the importance of understanding timeframes for migration and population admixture, archaeological dating remains absolutely necessary alongside radiocarbon or other scientific methods. Radiocarbon provides a range of typically 1 or 2 centuries, while archaeological dating methods can, when ideal, be as tight as a quarter or half century. One drawback to the latter, however, is that some archaeological dating can only give a terminus postquem. In this study, about 80 burials were dated by stratigraphy, 40 by radiocarbon, and 20 by both, showing a healthy dependence on both methods, depending no doubt on skeletal preservation, which will always be an issue for archaeogeneticists. In the burials dated both ways, the archaeology and the radiocarbon dates remarkably never contradicted each other, except in one burial from Croatia, where preservation may have negatively affected the radiocarbon date, which was overturned by more consistent archaeological data. Finally, a critical issue in which archaeology and archaeogenetics must inform each other: identity. This is by no means a new observation, and the issues are complex on both sides. If we rely on archaeology to label identity, we risk assuming that everyone who belonged to the same culture group was biologically similar. There were other factors, of course, ever-shifting ones, that archaeology cannot see on the ground that defined who people were. On the flip side, not everyone who carries the same genetic makeup embraced the same material culture or lifestyle. Assuming they did risks a biological essentialism dismissive of cultural aspects of identity. Without archaeology, archaeogenetics risks losing sight of how an individual's biological makeup shaped the cultural, social, and structural context to which he or she belonged. If archaeologists eschew archaeogenetic data, we risk overlooking perhaps one of the most important aspects of identity, through which our subject populations understood the same cultural, social, and structural context that they inhabited, whether new or old. The way forward, of course, is a close collaboration between archaeologists and archaeogeneticists, and a transparency of data between the two fields. On that final note, I'd like to again commend the CEL authors in how they embrace archaeology and include an archaeological overview to contextualize the ADNA samples. It's only hoped that other research teams will notice the benefits that this has had on sparking a much wider conversation that welcomes conclusions from collaborative and interdisciplinary studies of the human past. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Andrews. The time has come to welcome your questions and observations for our panelists, and to remind you that as is our custom, there will be a reception afterwards with a drink, as Professor Andrews kindly mentioned on my behalf, and some light refreshments. The floor is open to questions, comments, and ma'am. One moment.
Yeah.
We're going to mic the questions for our
Yeah.
remote viewers.
I just have to give a little background here. My field of study is the over 2,000 years worth of texts from Mesopotamia. And you can see in the sources there, in the text that you get, the influence of various peoples coming in and peoples leaving. My question is there a sufficiently large corpus that you have that you can actually see linguistic changes based on the migrations of people who have come in? Thank you.
With respect to the Danubian region, well, I think it was Professor Harper who raised that opinion, and I'm sure he will come in from Paris to supply an answer.
Sure. I mean, the region is relatively well represented by epigraphic sources. So
Inscriptions.
Inscriptions, and the study region is well represented with Latin inscriptions. So we know that before the Romans come, this region, the people who live in this region speak different forms of Illyrian languages. These are not very well known because there are no texts in ancient Illyrian, and it's only reconstructed from place names. And certainly the population that's using Latin and inscribing Latin is a subsample of the population, not necessarily representative. But we have historical witnesses who over time tell us that most of the people in the region are speaking Latin, or make observations that imply that Illyrian is only spoken by a minority of the population. So Latin, over the course of a few centuries, becomes the dominant language of the study region, the Middle Danube. And then, of course, in later antiquity, at some point, the language becomes predominantly Slavic. But this is a process that happens over the course of centuries. We first see the presence of Eastern European migrations in the archaeogenetic data from the 6th century. But it's not until the 7th, 8th, 9th century, sometime later, that the population turnover would have been significant enough to drive linguistic change. But it is worth noting that when we think of the post-Roman changes, that it's really in the Balkans and in Britain that the population changes are associated with really significant language turnover as well. So it's an interesting comparison with post-Roman Britain in that respect as well.
These are the two biggest migrations probably in late antiquity into Europe or across Europe that reflect linguistic change before the arrival of Islam. Britain and the arrival of the Slavic languages, the arrival of Germanic languages in Celtic Britain, and the Slavic languages in Central Europe. Ma'am.
Thank you so much for this really important work. I have two small related questions. One is, what is the relationship between the 146 individuals and potential population reconstructions of demographics around the area, either from those 146 or from other types of studies? I don't know if it's possible to do population reconstructions or important, and whether, what are the limitations of telling a story from 146 data points versus trying to reconstruct demographics based on what would have been a total number in the population. And
Before you get to your second question, clarification, by demography, you mean the size of the population?
And its composition, both.
And its composition.
Sorry, that's a big. And related to that, and back to the linguistic question, I saw you had a data point from Ploiești in Romania, which is well known to be one of the area that had maintained a Latin root to its language. So I wonder to what extent that data point is either extraneous or how you connect it to the languages which eventually evolved from Slavic in the rest of the region.
Professor Reich, we were just talking about this point. But let me emphasize, while Professor Reich gets the microphone, that ancestry does not equal language group. But we do observe that certain ancestries are much denser in certain linguistic speaking areas. So we can see there's a connection, but the connection is not predictive.
Yeah, there is an opportunity for learning about population size changes over time and to come up with results that can be integrated with other lines of evidence. That's one of the exciting frontiers that can come with this type of work, and it requires very large sample sizes that we're now beginning to get. So the way that you estimate population size off genetic data is you look at the rate at which pairs of individuals are distant cousins of each other. So if you look at you and a random person in this room, we're living in hundreds of millions of people in this area, and there's a pretty low probability that you're a distant cousin within like the 6th or 10th degree to a random person. But in a small place, you're a much higher probability. So by looking at the inverse of that number, you can get an estimate of the community size you're from. And so when you do this type of analysis, you can, an application we were involved in just a couple of years ago was in indigenous Native American populations in the Caribbean, and even across islands like Cuba and the Bahamas or Puerto Rico, there was a very high rate of close cousins, even across islands, and it indicated that the population size was 1 to 2 orders of magnitude smaller in terms of community sizes than the estimates that were prevailing in the literature. So that was very interesting because that sort of needs to be integrated within the historical record. Here, there's an opportunity for we were just talking about it earlier today with the same people who spoke today about doing this in different parts of the Roman imperial period and how one would go about doing that. The way that you're looking at the rate of of distant cousins. And so if you have only one pair of people, that's only one comparison. But if you have 10 comparisons, that's about 10 times 10 divided by 2 comparisons. And if you have 100 people, that's 50,000, 100, that's 5,000 comparisons. So it very rapidly increases the number of comparisons and you can make good estimates. So that's exciting. And then the other question I think was about Ploiești, and maybe Inigo could speak about that.
Yeah, so in Romania, in our dataset, we have very few samples, and one is the one you mentioned, and that sample looks like the other from Croatia and Romania in that respect. So it has this Eastern European ancestry like the others, but moving on to the present day, we see like Romanians have like the same general ancestry components as the other present-day countries that are around Romania, even though the language is different. So this is one case where we detect the same demographic changes, but different cultural trajectories end up with different languages in these two nation states. So that's a good example, and we see many others in the dataset that we studied.
I'm suggesting perhaps everyone could gather at we have table mics.
Yeah.
And then
Speakers, panelists, if you that might make things a little easier. Joseph Lazaridis, Dr. Lazaridis, I think had a question or an observation, which will certainly be precious.
Yes, I was wondering because the Italian Iron Age population and the Balkan Iron Age population, they're fairly close to each other. They're different, but close. And there's also the question of what was the border between the Italic languages and the Illyrian languages, and also the Celtic language that also have some role in central Italy. So basically, if any of the historians know what was the border between Italic and Illyrian. Obviously, the Adriatic is the big border between those two, but what happens at the north in the kind of interface between the two?
Kyle, do you have any insights on Illyrian versus Italic linguistic history? I thought so. Me neither.
That's reaching back too far, but I want to say they're not right next to each other on the linguistic phylogeny, but that's been a while. I'm not confident.
Yeah, in fact, if I'm not mistaken, there's even been debate whether that goes back quite a ways, whether Illyrian is connected with Albania and whether Albania is even Indo-European.
I don't think that was the question.
Basically, the question is that, okay, today, if we look at the distribution of languages, Italian and the Slavic languages that are on the other side of the Adriatic, they have some transition zone or like border kind of that corresponds with the border of Italy and kind of the Balkan countries. So in the period in question, Italic languages was distributed obviously, and Latin that eventually kind of absorbed all of them were distributed in the Italian peninsula. And the Paleo-Balkan languages were distributed somewhere in the Balkans. So what was the situation in the border between the two, where we would find those intermediate populations that would also be genetically intermediate? Anyway, so if we know anything about the border between the Italic and the Paleo-Balkan world, which maybe we don't, but the Adriatic Sea is south. I'm talking about north, like at the border between those two.
Joseph, as usual, you've asked a very challenging question to which I don't know the answer, and we may have someone up. Read, Morgan.
Brief searching suggests the Venetic language is an old Italic language that does border on Illyrian-speaking regions.
The Rhetic language.
Rhetic and then Venetic.
Venetic, I see. Yeah, okay. So the pre-Latin language of the Veneto region.
Thank you. I was just wondering, because we were talking about Italy and the Balkans being separated, and being surprised that since it was part of the Roman Empire, there was not more genetic material from Italians over there. I'm wondering, much further away, the Roman Empire, you mentioned Britain and the Celtic countries there, but the Roman Empire was there. Has there been any work genetically to see if there's any kind of leftover vestige of Roman genetics that far north, that far away?
We have in the present, that's an excellent question, thank you. And we have present in the audience, if you can reach back, Anne, for the microphone, Dr. Nick Patterson, who knows incredible amount of things.
My opinion is we see various outlying groups in Roman Britain. I think recently they found clearly a summation, and we have very interesting, perhaps, gladiator who was executed in York in northern Britain. But in the population as a whole, my view is that the Romans made extraordinarily little impact. I really think that Britain, just before the Saxons arrived, is not so different genetically from Britain before the Romans showed up. That's my current view, and we're still thinking about it. I was surprised at how little impact it seemed to make.
But Britain
genetic impact.
Culturally huge.
Culturally huge. We have, for example, we have an autobiographical document by probably a Briton of the 5th, to use that word, of the 5th century, a man by the name Patricius, who was enslaved by pirates and sold as a slave in Ireland, and left an autobiographical document, which is one of the earliest slave narratives in Western literature, the Confession of St. Patrick. And we can tell from the language of Patrick, of St. Patrick, that Latin was his mother tongue, and that he spoke a popular form of Latin, that is to say, a Latin that was the common language of the empire. So the degree of cultural Romanization is extremely deep in Britain. We have a question. Oops, David, please.
Great Britain in particular is the place in the world where there's the most exquisite ancient DNA record data available. It's about 1,000 individuals with genome scale data over almost every period since people resettled it after the Ice Age. The only significant gap, there's two significant gaps, is in the Roman period itself of published data, although there is unpublished data of that type that supports what Nick is saying. But that's the only area that hasn't been kind of systematically investigated, and also the later medieval period has not been substantially investigated.
Well, that's interesting, but there is a
Correct.
Because otherwise you think, well, did just all the Romans go home?
St. Patrick didn't go.
Except for the gladiator who was executed.
No.
Yeah, the dynamics in the Low Countries are actually a little bit similar, apparently, although there's less sampling there to what happens in Great Britain. So these Mediterranean, or at least central Mediterranean and Eastern Mediterranean dynamics seem different in terms of the impact of Romanization.
Yeah, and in fact, we can see in the Low Countries the linguistic impact that we've been talking about. It's common when you borrow something from a culture to borrow the word for it too. So sushi is not an American English word. It is now, but it wasn't at the origin. And so the Germanic-speaking peoples who would wind up in Britain and across Northern Europe, living in the Low Countries, were not familiar with what in vulgar Latin they called a discus, which became in English a dish, and in German, Tisch, a round table. So we can see the kind of pre-conquest assimilation and attraction to this glamorous culture of the Roman Empire preserved in the languages of the region still today, 2,000 years later. We have a question from one of our voluminous webinar participants on the internet. Could you share?
Yes. So this question, I think, was asked originally, Professor McCormick, during your talk. And I think it's a clarifying question regarding the marriage between archaeology and archaeogenetics. Mm-hmm. But how do you connect the same individual to different continents? I think this is about the individuals you pulled out.
How do we connect the individuals to different continents? This is the only individual on the Roman frontier whose genetic ancestry is entirely identical to that of people in East Africa today. That requires someone to have moved. He could have had two East African parents who moved to the Danube frontier, or he originated in some other center of population where the same genome today is to be found, which is in the area of Eastern Africa. That's the first indicator for this individual. The second individual, this person was not born on the Danube, or if he was, he immediately took a plane to the Mediterranean or to the Red Sea, because up until age 12, he had a diet that was very largely seafood, which is not available on the Danube. So these two indicators are strong ones that this individual or his parents came from an area where today we find the genome, or wherever that genome was present in the 2nd century of our era, but somewhere we know from the features of the genome in Africa, and indeed in Eastern Africa.
And also, if I may add something, also the fact that we only find one East African individual also probably tells us that he was a migrant himself, because if he had like other family members buried at Viminatium, we might have sampled them. So that's, I mean, this is not for sure, but this sort of tells us that it's him who migrated.
And remember, we would see the trace of this East African ancestry, not just in this young man, but if he had children in them, in some share of their genome, and so on with descendants. So we catch the signal of the people who are there, even if we can't see them, through their genetic impact on their descendants, who we can see.
So I was late, so if you already discussed it, please ignore my question. But Hungarian is the language that is not close to any of the Latin or Slavic languages. I'm wondering if genetically they're just as different as linguistically.
No, they are not. Genetically, they are very similar to the countries around Hungary with very different languages. But if you go and sequence the genomes of the early Hungarian conquerors, then they are definitely Asian in ancestry. But probably since they were very few compared to the whole populations, at some point they became absorbed by the rest of the population and the genetics diluted. So now in present day Hungarians, it's very difficult to find any trace of Asian ancestry, just because the different sizes between probably the conquerors were very few and they were an elite, and the remaining the rest of the bulk of the population. Yeah.
Can I add that the Hungarians didn't arrive there till the 10th century?
That's
yes.
Correct.
It's not in the area we were talking about.
Yes. Yes, that's true.
Yep.
But as Inigo has pointed out, the Hungarian population today, it's almost impossible to find an East Asian signal, whereas in the very small conquering elite populations of the 10th century, it has been detected. Sir, yes.
This is somewhat inspired by Joseph's comment, but he mentioned that the Iron Age Latin DNA is very similar to Iron Age Balkan DNA, and so I was curious if you thought that possibly there was some small or larger, but maybe just like a small amount of Latin DNA coming in from Italy that was somehow being like it's like difficult to distinguish from the that DNA, and kind of similarly actually also for the Germanic and maybe like the Sarmatian or probably less so, but maybe some of the Hunnic DNA even with like the later Slavic movements, if there could be like some amount of like it still exists in a small. It wasn't like they totally were killed off by the incomers or totally disappeared, but rather there was a small amount that was like it's kind of too small to distinguish. That's my question: is do you think that there could be some italic? And then later, persisting Germanic or maybe even Sarmatian ancestry that's just not big enough to distinguish, but still there.
Yeah, I think regarding the Italian, I think there could be some low proportion that we are not able to distinguish from the, let's say, like more northern Balkan Iron Age ancestry. But there's also, we didn't talk about it today, but there's also the Y chromosome evidence in the Italian peninsula. There is a Y chromosome type that is the most common one in the Italian peninsula, and is different from the one that you find in the Balkans during the Iron Age. And we don't see basically any of the Italian type in the Balkans. So I don't think we might be missing a little bit, but I don't think that is like some. There's definitely not a huge amount of demographic impact from the Italian. I said from people with Italian ancestry, but it could be from the Italian peninsula, just not from people with Iron Age Italian ancestry, because we know, as I think Mike said, that Rome or Central Italy was predominantly Anatolian in ancestry during the imperial period. So they could actually be coming from Italy, but it would be those Anatolians that we saw, the ones that are coming from Italy and not directly from Anatolia. So yeah, thank you.
Good question.
Hi, so I'm curious because you've talked a lot so far about what we can understand about culture, especially migration through DNA evidence. But I'm wondering, again, if this is within the scope of the data, I'm wondering what we can see about how DNA changes within populations through migration have affected the culture of those populations. Like, for example, if we're seeing changes in pastoralism or diet based on an increase or decrease in lactose persistence rates, etc.
Answer this one.
Inigo, you know about this as much as I do. Okay, so I mean, the millet is an isotopic question. So I'm not. Maybe Inigo's not very enough familiar with the isotopic trajectories in this part of the world at this time. Is someone here familiar with that evidence?
I don't know that much.
Yeah, I don't think we are in the position yet to do that, but we will probably be able to do that in the future when we have even more integration of the genetic data with other types of data, such as isotopic data. I mean, we do it in this paper, but we just have a few individuals. So
quite exceptional.
But in the future, I guess, when you can imagine having like hundreds of individuals with this genome and with the isotopic data and with other type of archaeological data, and that's when we will be able to do it. So far, I don't think we are in that position.
But there is an observation from a 2021 paper that some of us were on, comparing the lactase persistence trajectory in two places in Europe where we have exquisite sampling trajectories. One is Great Britain and the other is Central Europe, including Hungary. And what you see, and this is sort of a discovery Inigo made actually, was that the rise in the big rise in frequency from under 10% in the population to 50% or more occurs in Great Britain in the first millennium BC, but it occurs in Central Europe in the first millennium AD. So 1,000 years later, so for whatever reason, that rises later, maybe different relationships to dairy products.
I just like to flick in a comment on that.
Nick Patterson has a comment.
That's a challenge to the archaeologists. It suggests to me that somehow how cattle were being treated in Britain and in Central Europe was different. I'm sorry. It suggests to me that there's some difference in the cattle raising procedures in Britain and Central Europe, so that milk is somehow more important in Britain, and there are higher selective pressures on lactose. So that's a conjecture, and that's really a challenge to the archaeologists to try and figure out what that might mean.
At least at the beginning, it becomes very important in Central Europe 1,000 years later.
Reed has a question.
Can I ask just regarding this question of the missing Romans on the Roman frontier, what do we know from the textual evidence about the origins of the military cohorts that were sent there and possibly colonia or land grants to retired soldiers in this region of the Danube, if we know anything?
So, Viminacium's Legio Septima Claudia. I don't know if you know anything about the recruitment of the 7th Legion, Claudian. Kyle, I don't. One can check this, but yeah.
No, the answer is that we do know quite a bit about the military presence in the region. There's a lot of veteran settlement, military colonies, both along the Adriatic coast. That region is supposedly full of areas that were settled by discharged veterans, and then as well even in the Middle Danube region. So that's why it's a little surprising that we don't see the Italian component. Now, in principle, the legions should be recruited from Roman citizen populations, but that of course changes. And by the 2nd century already, there's a lot of local recruitment into the legions. So that's certainly a factor that I think we're seeing reflected.
And I can add to that when we review closely the individuals, we can see a number of sites which are military sites. A site, Ravna in, I believe, Serbia, which is identified as Timacum Minus, a Roman fortress and mining area. The cemetery are overwhelmingly male. They show healed or not healed battle wounds or typical combat injuries on their bodies. And we didn't have any people of Italic origin there. The chronology is mostly 3rd and 4th century, if memory serves. So it's after a time when Italy is dominating the recruitment of the legions.
Just as a follow-up, I guess, given the Antonio study's findings of the huge Eastern Mediterranean impact on the demography of Italy itself, would it be unsurprising to see that recruitment in Italy of legionaries is actually recruiting from an Anatolian-looking genetic ancestry?
Shouldn't be. Why should it be? No, absolutely. And that's again the possibility that I think Inigo raised, or David, that some of the migrants that we see elsewhere in the empire are actually coming from the city of Rome, but they are descendants of people who migrated to Rome a generation or 2 or 3 or 4 earlier from Asia Minor, from the Levant, from the Eastern Mediterranean, from the Aegean Sea. So it's entirely possible. And we do see people with, if memory serves now, this I'm speaking from memory, looking at the people in the military cemetery at Timacum Minus, there are a few, they're mostly Balkan Iron Age, so locals, which is interesting. But there are some admixed with Anatolian.
Yeah, and yes, to add something, for me, it's surprising to not find like Italians in the Balkans during the Roman period, but it's even more surprising to not find Italians in Rome during the Roman period. So we also have to discuss that because
at least with the sampling that we have now, with the data we have now, Italy, not only Rome, but central Italy, as Mike mentioned, looks very, very Anatolian in ancestry and not so much Italian Iron Age. So that's another point to take into account.
I think it's a part of your theory that the Anatolians in the Balkans might be coming from Italy is the fact that, as far as I know, the Northern Balkans, both epigraphically and like linguistically, are kind of fully Latin. There's no evidence of Greek, for example. Because if the Anatolians came directly from Anatolia to the Balkans, you would think that they would introduce some kind of Greek epigraphy or kind of linguistic culture. Whereas if they came from the Anatolians that went to Italy, it's more plausible that they would introduce a Latin linguistic culture there.
I'm sure, Kyle, there are Greek inscriptions from our area, but few in number, such as you find also on the Rhine frontier. They're everywhere, the Greeks, but in small numbers in terms of the epigraphic, inscriptional
for example, I know that in Rome itself, the historical sources obviously say that there are lots of Greeks coming.
And there are tens of thousands.
Lots of Greek epigraphy, whereas it's less, I feel, in the Northern Balkans.
True. But also a thinner epigraphic record in the northern parts compared to the city of Rome. No further questions? That's great. It's fantastic. The questions you've asked have been absolutely amazing and push us forward in trying to understand this complex data. This is the first public discussion of this data. It's been a privilege to have that discussion with you and to be inspired and stimulated by your often impossible and wonderfully stimulating questions. So thank you very, very much to all. I will remind you that we will raise a happy glass, and we will raise that glass. Before we go, I want to just offer you a word from the inside. You attend these events, you see how smoothly they run, especially given that there's madmen like me and Yigo and David, and we'll leave Meg out of it, but Vicky and Selene, and things can get really crazy with us trying to do a million things all at once. And if they've gone smoothly for the last 8 years, like everything else that we've been trying to do in this impossible dream of creating a new discipline with no support, with no backing, but with just our desire to do so and working together, all of this has been made possible by someone who has quietly, tactfully, with extraordinary discipline and dedication, has made this happen. And I'm speaking about our coordinator, Lisa Ransom-Lubar, who's been handing the microphone around for 8 years and has made all of this happen. And to our chagrin, but also our happiness for her, Lisa is moving on to a new phase in her career. She is giving vent to her artistic gifts, and she's going to consecrate herself to her art beginning next month. So we're very happy for Lisa. We're sad that she's going. We're thrilled with all she's done to help build this new discipline, this intellectual and spiritual and human community of investigators and questions. And we'll have an opportunity to toast her directly in the reception that follows. But in the meantime, thank you, Lisa. You've been amazing.